The Black Gate groans open beneath a sky, the color of ash and old bone. The captains of the West stand motionless in that terrible silence before battle. Aragorn at their head, Gandalf beside him, white staff in hand. Behind them, a small army, defiant, desperate, and utterly outmatched by the legions gathering in the shadow of Mordor. And then a single rider emerges from that darkness.
My master, Sauron the Great, bids thee welcome.
Not Sauron himself, not one of the 9. A man. He rides forward on a monstrous horse, its skull-like head wreathed in flame where eyes should be. The rider wears black robes and a helm shaped for cruelty rather than protection. When he speaks, his voice carries neither rage nor mockery, only the calm, measured certainty of someone announcing an outcome already decided. I am the Mouth of Sauron. He doesn't shout, doesn't posture. The title alone, he believes, should extinguish hope. Then he draws forth the proof. Frodo's mithril coat, shining even in that poisoned light. An elven cloak, gray as twilight. Sam's short sword, still stained from Cirith Ungol. The ring-bearer, he declares, has been captured, tortured. The quest has failed. The war is over before the first blow is struck. For one terrible moment, even the bravest hearts waver. But here lies the question Tolkien embeds beneath this scene. Quiet as a buried blade. Who is this man? Because the Mouth of Sauron is not some creature spawned in shadow. Not an orc given speech, or a wraith bound by ancient sorcery. He is something far more disturbing. He is a human being who chose this path, step by deliberate step, and never looked back. Tolkien tells us the Mouth of Sauron was in Minrian, and that detail matters. The Minrians were once the greatest of all mortal men. They lived longer than others, learned faster, built stronger kingdoms, and stood beside the elves as allies against the dark. At the height of their power, even Sauron himself once bowed before their king. But Minor did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it wanted more. As the centuries passed, its people began to fear death. They envied the elves their immortality. They began to believe that power, not wisdom, was the true measure of greatness. And when their island was finally swallowed by the sea, some of those who had embraced pride and domination escaped to Middle-earth. These survivors became known as the Blackened Minrians, men of sharp minds and colder ambitions, who settled in the south and never abandoned their hunger for control. The Mouth of Sauron came from this world. He was not a brute or a fanatic. He would have been educated, articulate, trained in law and rhetoric, the kind of man who understands how to move power quietly instead of swinging it like a weapon. And Tolkien makes something very clear. He entered the service of the Dark Tower willingly, not captured, not enslaved. He chose it. Sauron offered what Minrian pride had always desired: longer life, forbidden knowledge, proximity to something vast and unstoppable. And this man believed completely that Sauron would win. That belief is the key. He did not serve out of fear. He served because he thought he had chosen the winning side. Tolkien writes something extraordinary about the Mouth of Sauron. His name is remembered in no tale, for he himself had forgotten it. In Tolkien's world, names are never trivial. They carry weight, lineage, identity, the essence of who you are and who your people were. To forget your own name is not metaphorical. It is the annihilation of self. Over the long centuries of his service, something profound occurred. He stopped thinking of himself as separate from his role. His thoughts aligned perfectly with Sauron's will. His ambitions became indistinguishable from his master's designs. His very speech became an extension of the Dark Lord's intent. He didn't just obey orders, he internalized them until there was no boundary left between command and desire. This is what makes him more psychologically disturbing than an orc or even a Nazgul. The 9 were enslaved through rings of power. Their souls were consumed by sorcery beyond their control. The Mouth of Sauron surrendered his soul willingly, piece by piece, year by year, until nothing remained but function. And because he believed with absolute certainty in Sauron's inevitable triumph, he spoke at the Black Gate without hesitation, without doubt, without even the faintest tremor of fear. In his mind, history had already concluded. The rest was merely paperwork. Sauron is a Maya, a being of immense spiritual power who existed before the world took shape. He doesn't need an ambassador. So why send a human to the Black Gate? Because the Mouth serves a purpose beyond diplomacy. If Sauron himself had manifested, the confrontation would have become mythic, almost cosmic in scale. But a man standing there, articulate and composed, speaking in measured diplomatic language, that makes the horror intimate. He is living proof that evil doesn't only corrupt monsters and wraiths, it recruits the ambitious. the intelligent, those who believe themselves wise enough to align with power and benefit from its ascendance. The Mouth speaks the language of treaties and territorial agreements, but twisted into something obscene. He offers terms as if subjugation were merely policy rather than annihilation. Withdraw your forces beyond the Anduin. Disarm your remaining armies. Accept tributary status under Mordor's governance. This isn't the chaos of orc hordes. This is bureaucratic domination, conquest dressed in the language of administration. And the most chilling detail? The Mouth clearly expects to be rewarded for his long loyalty. Tolkien implies that Sauron intended to appoint a lieutenant to govern the conquered western lands. The Mouth of Sauron, after centuries of faithful service, obviously believes that role belongs to him. He doesn't just think he's witnessing Sauron's victory. He thinks he's about to inherit a kingdom. When the Mouth presents Frodo's belongings, he watches their reactions with the careful attention of a trained interrogator. This is not theater for its own sake. He's gathering intelligence. If the captains collapse into despair, it will confirm Sauron's suspicion. The Ring-Bearer was central to their entire strategy, and his capture means total victory. But Aragorn doesn't break. Gandalf doesn't beg. Instead, Gandalf demands proof that Frodo still lives. The Mouth refuses. Accept our terms or reject them. There will be no assurances, no evidence, no negotiation beyond submission. Then Gandalf takes a step forward and seizes the tokens from his hands. It's a small gesture, almost insignificant, but it shatters the carefully constructed illusion. Because in that moment, the Mouth realizes something fundamental has shifted. These men aren't behaving like defeated enemies hoping to salvage scraps from catastrophe. They aren't calculating how much territory they can preserve through surrender. They're buying time. For what? He cannot determine. But the confidence in their defiance suggests knowledge he doesn't possess. For the first time in that exchange, uncertainty enters his mind. And uncertainty is something Sauron cannot afford. The Mouth retreats through the Black Gate. The assembled armies of Mordor surge forward in a black tide. But the psychological battle has already tilted. Sauron now knows there exists some element outside his calculations. Some piece of the pattern he has failed to account for. That sliver of doubt, in the end, proves fatal. The Mouth of Sauron's horror doesn't lie in physical grotesqueness. In Tolkien's book, he isn't the twisted, lipless monstrosity from the films. His terror operates on a subtler frequency entirely. He is articulate, controlled, educated, utterly rational within his own framework. He represents the endpoint of pride divorced from conscience, ambition unrestrained by any limiting principle beyond self-advancement. Saruman also sought power, but Saruman rationalized his corruption. He genuinely believed he could manipulate the darkness for his own purposes, that his intelligence made him immune to domination. The Mouth of Sauron harbors no such illusions. He doesn't attempt to control Sauron or negotiate a partnership of equals. He simply dissolves himself into service and calls that victory. This is the deeper horror Tolkien presents. Because the Legendarium demonstrates repeatedly that evil doesn't triumph solely through violence. It thrives through collaboration, through those who calculate which direction power flows and align themselves accordingly, who trade principle for proximity to the winning side. The Mouth of Sauron embodies what happens when intelligence severs itself from humility, when ambition replaces identity, when a man decides that survival on the ascendant side of history matters more than preserving whatever he once was. He gains centuries of life, influence over nations, authority in the shadow of ultimate power. And in that transaction, he loses the only thing that could have made those gains meaningful: his name, the person he had been, himself. Tolkien doesn't describe the Mouth's final fate in detail, but we know he survives the parley. He retreats inside the gate before the battle begins. What happens to him afterward, when the ring is destroyed and Sauron's tower collapses into ruin, remains unrecorded. And perhaps that silence is more eloquent than any description could be. Because without Sauron, what does he become? He constructed his entire identity around serving an external will. When that will disintegrates in an instant, there is nothing beneath. No foundation, no core, no self to return to. The Nazgul fade away with their master, released into whatever lies beyond. The Mouth must face something potentially worse. Not oblivion. Emptiness. In a legendarium populated by dragons and balrogs, by fallen angels and immortal tyrants, Tolkien chose to make one of his most deeply unsettling figures an ordinary man who made a series of deliberate, rational choices. that is not accidental. The Mouth of Sauron is not a cautionary tale about magical corruption or irresistible enchantment. He is a warning about moral surrender. He demonstrates that the most terrifying transformation available to us is not being twisted against our will by external forces. It is the slow, voluntary reshaping of ourselves around power until we can no longer remember who we were before we began seeking it. At the Black Gate, two figures stand in opposition. Aragorn, the heir who waited decades in shadow, who bore every burden required of him before claiming the authority that was his by right. The Mouth, the servant who seized proximity to power immediately and permitted it to define him completely. One becomes king, the other becomes a voice. And when the Dark Tower finally falls and the shadow lifts from Middle-earth, only one of them still possesses a name.